Hi everyone, welcome to the video on strategic groups. So far, we've been talking about classifying a firm's external environment according to the macro-environmental donut, which is at the societal level, the competitive environment, which consists of the industries that most directly touch the focal industry. And today I'm going to provide you with one other way to classify the competitors within an industry. And so what we're essentially doing is looking at, if you want to think of it this way, the sprinkles on the donut hole, right? We're looking at the individual firms that are operating inside that circle that says rivalry among existing competitors. And one of the reasons that we do this is because many industries are so large that competitors don't really directly compete on every area of the business. And because you have limited resources in any firm, in terms of time, attention, and money, you want to make sure that you're spending those resources competing with the most important alternate competitor. In other words, you don't want to design strategy to compete with someone who's much larger than you are or much smaller than you are if you're not concerned about those elements. So when it comes to making a strategic group map, you start with dimensions. And these 8 dimensions are ways of examining all the competitors inside any industry. So they apply to every industry everywhere. But when you apply them to different kinds of industries, they start to look a little bit different. Now, typically, when you're classifying strategic group maps, you're going to look at them across different levels, right? So you're going to look at price or quality across high, medium, or low. But then some of them, their version of high, medium, or low can be classified according to their specific dimension. So you would look at local, regional, national, global. You would look at retail, wholesale, internet for use of distribution channels. And that's the way that you would classify all the firms that are interacting in an industry. Let me give you an example. So when you apply the dimensions to the department store industry and the car manufacturing industry, you can see right away that there are some things on which the dimensions are exactly the same. So when we're talking about price, and I usually suggest picking just 2 levels, just high or low, because otherwise you can start to get a little messy in terms of your designations. So when you look at price across the department store industry or the car manufacturer, you're really looking at the average item price. And so with the car manufacturers, with some car manufacturers, that's going to be a really wide variation. So when you look at Ford, you have very small cars that are specifically designed to be entry into the market kinds of cars that are designed to be affordable. And then you're going to have pickup trucks that are very much not. What you want to try to avoid doing when you're applying the dimensions is picking either end of that spectrum. You want to try to stay right there in the middle with the average item price. The same thing goes when you start to apply things like geographic coverage, which is for department stores, there are a very few that are international. Mostly we see national level ones because the state and local area ones have almost all been acquired at this point with the national level geographic coverage. For car manufacturers, though, you find some car manufacturers that are international, some that only operate in the first world countries, and some that operate nationally. And so you would want to use that as your high, medium, and low. For product line breadth, we're talking about the number of products or the variety of products that anyone sells, right? So in the department store industry, that's going to mean the number of departments. So do they have a shoe department? Do they have a tire center? And that would be a very high variety, right? And so you would put that on the high side. Alternately, you can have a department store that only sells shoes, clothes, and home goods. And so in comparison to the one that has the shoes, clothes, home goods, appliances, and tire center, and many other departments in addition to that, you would be looking at one, if it only had 2 or 3 departments, you would be looking at a low product line breadth. Now, when you look at the auto manufacturers, you're looking at the number of car types. So not models, because models are going to vary widely, but you want to look at the number of car types. So do they have a convertible and a pickup? Do they have a sedan, an SUV, a minivan, a station wagon? And depending on the number of those, you would you'd classify as high or low. When it comes to the degree of service offered, you want to think about the level of customer service typically. And so in the department store industry, you'd be able to see signs of this in the fitting rooms, whether or not they offer a personal shopper, whether or not they have tailoring services on site, and a coffee shop or a restaurant. For the auto manufacturers, you can think about the actual customer service inside the dealership. Do they offer loaner cars? What's the quality of the food and the drink in the service area? Will they pick you up and take you back to your home or your workplace when your car is ready? Then you also have the idea of the use of distribution channels, and these are the ways in which you can purchase items from these retailers. In the department store industry, this tends to be across a limited number. Typically, the department stores are all retailers. They're direct-to-consumer retailers. They can also sometimes use reselling services. And although all the department stores now use e-commerce, that used to be a way that you could classify all of the competitors in the industry because some of them had better e-commerce than others. For auto manufacturers, though, your use of distribution channels is very low. Almost all of them are held to contracts with the dealership network, with a very, very specialized few who can sell direct to the consumer. And so again, I'll remind you that even though you might have purchased or think that you could purchase a car through the internet, in almost every case, with the exception of one or two, in almost every case, you're actually buying from the dealership network. Even if you're buying online, you're buying from the dealer, not from the auto manufacturer. So in other words, you cannot buy a car from Honda. You have to buy a car from the Honda group or from the Nichols Honda organization in your local area hometown. And that's that dealership network with whom the car manufacturers maintain a very tight relationship. Your degree of vertical integration is going to relate to how many of the inbound logistics, manufacturing, distribution, and customer service parts of the organization that your focal company does, right? And so for department stores, that would mean, do they make their own clothing? Not do they make their own lines, because typically that's going to be, typically they'll have their own lines, but they don't make them. They contract with somebody else to make them. And then do they handle their own sales and retailing? Do they deal with the outbound logistics or the delivery? And then how much of the service do they handle? And so you'll see differences across competitors for that. For the auto manufacturers, you end up with, do they manufacture their own parts? Do they manufacture the cars, handle the sales, and deal with the service? And for most of the auto manufacturers, because of the number of contracts that they have going with parts suppliers and with the dealership network, most car manufacturers only manufacture cars. They get parts in from other people and they put them together and they give them to the dealership network. So they only handle manufacturing. So the degree of vertical integration across that entire industry is pretty low. The last one is degree of diversification, which in both industries is going to relate to the number of industries in which they operate. And so if you think about the auto manufacturers, if you think about somebody like Honda, Honda operates business in a wide variety of industries, right? They make jet engines and cars and motorcycles and lawnmowers. And so they have a high level of diversification versus somebody like Hyundai, who primarily only makes cars, or Toyota, who sort of sticks inside that industry particularly. So let me show you what it looks like when you follow the rules related to building out a strategic group. Specifically, your rules are that you can pick 2 dimensions, and the picking of dimensions ends up being very specifically important, right? But your group map will get constructed on the basis of 2 dimensions. So you're going to pick one for the y-axis and one for the x-axis. And you want to pick the dimensions that the industry competes on. Because if you don't, you end up with an array of strategic groups that doesn't really apply to your industry, right? So when we were talking about the auto manufacturers, if you pick something like vertical integration and degree of diversification, very few of the competitors inside that industry compete on those specific ones, right? And so those dimensions are going to be more applicable to a different industry. So you want to pick the dimensions that the consumers care about, because that's where the money is going to be. That's the way that the organization is going to, the way that the industry is going to compete against other members of the industry. So the other one is don't pick highly correlated dimensions. So when you look at things like price and quality, almost always price and quality are going to travel together. And so what you've really done when you pick price and quality is you've made it so that you are dimensionalizing the industry along essentially just one line, right? Because they're all going to, if they're a competitor that charges high prices, that's because they're exchanging that for high quality of goods. And so you're just going to get a point that's high. And then you're going to have some that are low, and you're going to have a bunch of them that are in the middle, but you'll only end up with one line, and you won't be able to see the strategic groups as they array across the industry. So let's go back to our two example industries. When you look at the department store industry and you pick the two dimensions that matter the most, the ones that you're really going to think about are price and quality, right? Because I just told you that those are effectively the same kind of a thing, particularly when you think about it inside the department store industry. They aren't always the exact same thing, but almost always. And then your geographic coverage also ends up being a major way in which department stores compete, which is a big part of what drove all of the mergers and acquisitions in this industry a while back. So when you pick those two, you're going to put them on the X and the Y axis, and then you are going to break it apart into the levels, right? And I suggest high and low, but you can do high, medium, and low for each of them. And you can do the geographic coverage according to, local would be low, international would be high. And you get a map that looks like this. And so part of what this strategic group map tells you is which competitors compete head-to-head with each other, right? And so if you look at the peach-colored circle in the middle, Macy's, Nordstrom, and Dillard, they all have sort of an average price or quality of item, and they have a geographic coverage. This is a while ago, but they have a geographic coverage with few localities, right? Macy's has since changed that up quite significantly. Many of them are going through periods of retrenchment at the moment, and so they've moved across this geographic coverage x-axis many times. But for the most part, they've kept the price or quality in that medium range, right? They're not in the Walmart or Kmart range of low price and low quality, and they're not in the high range of Gucci, Chanel, and Fendi. And so you can see then that those three, at least at the point in time when your book drew this strategic group map, those three were the ones that went together. And so part of what a group map does is group the competitors that consider each other when they design strategy, right? So when you look at Walmart and Kmart, they're not competing with Gucci, Chanel, and Fendi. They just aren't. They could, because there's a lot of money in the Walmart circle, but they generally aren't designing strategic initiatives to try to beat Gucci, Chanel, and Fendi, because there's just no point. That's not who they want to be, right? And so this group map starts to show you who they consider when they design their strategic initiatives, who they'll look to, right? And it helps to focus your strategic design. The other thing that it shows you is the size of the market that they serve. So the Walmart market is much larger than the Gucci, Chanel, and Fendi market, which tracks, right? I mean, that's a thing that you intuitively know. But the size of the circle helps to show you not just who competes against each other, but also the size of the market that they serve. And you can dimensionalize these groups along the lines, whichever lines you can analyze and defend, because typically a lot of people would throw Target into this Walmart, Kmart circle as well. So let me show you a little bit of what this looks like when we apply the dimensions that we care about to the auto manufacturing industry instead. And so the average item price and the quality, they tend to travel pretty closely together, right? And so for quality, I suggest that you consider that to be the features that are on their average car, or the performance of their average car, or the reputation of the brand. Reputation is also sometimes a proxy measure for quality. And so those two, again, are going to travel very closely together, right? The more features there are on the car, the more you expect to pay for it. The better the reputation of the brand, the more you expect to pay for their car. And so we're going to consider those as one dimension. But then geographic coverage is not a thing that most of the auto manufacturing industry competes on. It's a little bit. There are competitors who only compete inside the US or only compete in England. Only sell their cars in one country. There are very few that sell fully internationally. That's really a hard strategic group to find. You've got many, many, many firms that will sell in all of the first world countries. And so the auto manufacturers, geographic coverage is not as great a dimension to use as your other axis. Instead, it's going to be product line breadth, which is the number of car types. And so you can see that as auto manufacturers add in additional car types, right, in general, they sort of start to get bigger. And so you've got somebody like Toyota who offers many different kinds of sedans, right, let alone the fact that they have almost every kind of car type represented as well, versus somebody much smaller than that, like Ferrari, that only makes sports cars, right? And so that ends up being something that you can dimensionalize the industry on pretty easily. And when you do, it looks like this. And so part of what you see here in this strategic group map are the people who compete against each other. Again, you've got the circles to represent the sizes of the competitors, or the sizes of the market that the competitors in that circle serve, right? And so what you start to see there is that you've got this one strategic group that's up at the top that consists of Porsche and Ferrari. And I would encourage you to think about this as being, the 80s. They had very few models. They were almost all, or very few car types. They were almost all sports cars in both. They competed on price or performance or reputation, whichever way you want to consider that. But they didn't serve a very large market. And that ends up being key to a conversation that we're going to have in one second. In contrast, you've got people like GM and Ford, or competitors like GM and Ford, that focus on the lower end of the price or performance side of things, but offer many different models in order to serve a much larger market. And so this helps to explain a little bit of the history of Porsche, right? So Porsche made just sports cars for a very long time in its history, and it was famous for them. And the 911 was the sort of definitive body shape for a sports car, and that's the one that they used inside the movie Cars because it was such a definitive version of a sports car. But as they got older and as they grew, that target market for them, that circle, it started to get smaller and smaller because it was much harder to afford to build such a high performance vehicle with the level of quality and reputation that they wanted, but sell it at a price that people could afford. And so consequently, they were watching their market shrink. And when they looked across the strategic group map, they saw that there was a strategic group very nearby that they could capitalize on by changing just a few things about what they did as a car firm, right? And so I'm, of course, talking about the circle that's right next to them in terms of the BMW and Mercedes-Benz circle. And so in order to compete inside that circle, Porsche really didn't have to compromise all that much on the price or their reputation or the performance of the vehicle, but they did have to start offering more varieties of models or more types of cars, more product line breadth. And so they introduced the first of their models. They introduced the Cayenne, which was an SUV that borders really, really closely on a minivan. And now they have an SUV, they have a sedan, they have a station wagon, they have a smaller SUV, and so they've increased the number of models without having to compromise a whole lot on that price, reputation, or performance side of things. And they got themselves into a much larger market. And this is very likely the thing that saved Porsche, even though the introduction of the SUV was not a move that made a whole lot of investors happy when it first happened. And the Porsche family was pretty upset by the idea that they would do that. It ended up being something that helped them access much more potential profit. And so in this way, a strategic group map can also indicate to you if you're looking for a growth initiative or you're looking for a recommendation for a firm to make more money. Sometimes a strategic group map helps to show you not just the next closest strategic group, but also where there is more money to be accessed and what you have to do to move between groups. And so for Porsche to move into that next nearest circle, all it needed to do was make more models because that's the axis that it moved down. You could argue that they maybe needed to lower their prices a little bit, and in some ways they did with this most recent model that they've released. But really the key to competing inside that circle, to moving out of the Ferrari circle and starting to compete in the BMW and Mercedes-Benz circle, was to make more models. And so in that way, that strategic group provided the action or the recommendation for Porsche when they were looking for growth. So thank you very much for watching. That's the strategic group video.